The quiet town of St. John, Washington, is the kind of place where front porches are for watching the sunset and neighbors aren't just faces you recognize. They're people you've known since kindergarten. It's a town of about 500 people, a tiny speck in the Palouse region south of Spokane, where the primary school is the heartbeat of the community. In a place this small, reputation is everything. You are who the town says you are. And in early 2026, Mackenzie Knott was exactly what a small town admires. A 25-year-old first-grade teacher at St. John Elementary, molding the youngest minds in the district. Her husband, also an integral part of the local fabric, served as an assistant track coach at the high school. They were, by all outward appearances, a stable, contributing couple in the tight-knit St. John School District. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. But inside their home, the foundation was allegedly crumbling. Behind the curated Facebook photos of school events and local track meets, court documents suggest a marriage defined by mutual infidelity, brewing anger, and a complete erosion of trust. Mackenzie would later describe a relationship that had been fractured for months, claiming her husband had cheated on her 8 months prior, an event she says shattered their bond. By Saturday night, May 9, 2026, that tension had reached a boiling point. The Knotts were hosting friends at their home, another couple who witnessed the visible cracks in the marriage. As the evening progressed, the husbands left for a period, leaving Mackenzie and her female friend behind. When the husbands returned, the atmosphere turned toxic. An argument erupted between Mackenzie and her husband, so intense that the prospect of divorce was openly discussed. The friend, seeking an escape from the volatility, retreated to a spare bedroom to sleep, but the silence didn't last. She was soon awakened by the sound of continued fighting. Mackenzie entered the guest room, asking to borrow the friend's phone, a detail that would later pique the interest of investigators. While Mackenzie eventually fell into an intoxicated sleep, her husband's suspicion reached a fever pitch. He had noticed something off about the way she was guarding her phone. Using a password he had known from the past, he waited until she was asleep to access the device. What he found wasn't just evidence of a typical affair. He scrolled through Snapchat messages that didn't involve another adult, but rather a 16-year-old boy, a high school junior, and a family friend. Even more jarring? The boy was an athlete on the very track team the husband helped coach. He didn't just find texts. He found digital receipts of a meeting that had occurred a week prior. According to the records, at approximately 2 a.m. on Sunday, May 3rd, while the rest of St. John was asleep, Mackenzie had allegedly slipped out of her house to meet the teenager. The boy, referred to in court as John Doe or JD, would later tell police that Mackenzie had been flirty in their digital exchanges, and despite his own reservations about the late-hour rendezvous, she had convinced him to meet. They reportedly met in the middle of the street near her home before he drove them to a secluded hill. There, under the cover of darkness, the boundary between a teacher and a child was allegedly erased. Back in the present, on that tense Saturday night, the husband was no longer just a scorned spouse. He was a coach who recognized a victim. He didn't wait for morning. He picked up the phone and called the authorities, handing over the screenshots that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. As the police arrived at the Knott residence in the early hours of Sunday, May 10th, the town of St. John was about to wake up to a reality it wasn't prepared for. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The arrest of Mackenzie Knott on Sunday, May 10th, 2026, sent an immediate shockwave through the St. John School District. Within hours, the 25-year-old was no longer the teacher in Room 1. She was a defendant facing a charge of sexual misconduct with a minor. The district, acting with the swiftness required in a small town where rumors travel faster than news, placed her on immediate leave. They issued a formal statement to the Spokesman Review, confirming they were cooperating fully with law enforcement and conducting an internal investigation. The message was clear: she was not to be on campus, and her connection to the children of St. John was severed. When investigators first sat down with Mackenzie, the narrative she provided was one of deflection and minimization. She admitted to the Snapchat messages and the 2 a.m. meeting on May 3rd, but the details were drastically different from what her husband's screenshots suggested. She initially told police it was nothing more than a little kiss. She reportedly tried to shift the dynamic of the encounter, describing the 16-year-old as a very flirtatious boy. She blamed her state of mind on a combination of high-level intoxication and medication that made her memories fuzzy. However, the physical evidence on the phone told a more detailed story. Detectives also had the statement of the 16-year-old victim. JD's account was clinical and devastating. He described the drive to the hill, the progression of the encounter, and the specific sexual acts that occurred. He told investigators that Mackenzie had climbed on top of him and initiated the intercourse. Most importantly, he revealed the power dynamic at play. After the act, Mackenzie had allegedly instructed him not to tell anyone, a clear indication that she understood the illegality and the gravity of what had just transpired. Confronted with the stark contrast between her little kiss story and the evidence gathered from JD and her husband's phone, Mackenzie's defense began to crumble. The fuzzy memories suddenly sharpened. In a follow-up interview, she changed her tune entirely. She admitted she had lied during the initial contact. She confessed to the full sexual encounter on that Sunday morning, admitting that she knew JD was only 16 years old, a child in the eyes of the law, but claimed he felt like one of her friends. This admission was the final piece the prosecution needed. While the defense might later argue that the husband's access to the phone was a violation of privacy, or that the intoxication played a role in her judgment, her own confession created a nearly insurmountable hurdle. She wasn't just a woman caught in an affair. She was a mandated reporter, a professional trained to identify and prevent the very exploitation she was now admitting to. While the legal case built steam, the social fallout in St. John was immediate. This wasn't a crime committed in a vacuum. The husband, still reeling from the discovery, had reportedly messaged JD directly after finding the texts. His message was blunt: "You effed my wife and now there's an issue." The boy's simple reply of "yeah" served as a secondary, informal confession that the husband handed over to police. On Monday, Mackenzie appeared in court for her initial hearing. Prosecutors didn't mince words, highlighting the significant impact this had on the victim. In a town where the high school and elementary school are the social hubs, JD's privacy was effectively non-existent. The prosecutor pointed out that in a small area like St. John, things get out very quickly, and the safety and well-being of John Doe were the state's primary concerns. As Mackenzie stood before the judge, the reality of her situation began to set in. She was facing a felony charge that carried a maximum of 5 years in prison. But the legal battle was just beginning, and a specific procedural hurdle was looming on the horizon. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the case moved toward arraignment, the legal community and the public began to dissect the specific statutes under which Mackenzie Knott was being charged. In Washington state, the crime of sexual misconduct with a minor is treated with particular severity when the perpetrator is an educator. Although JD was not Mackenzie's direct student, she taught first grade and he was a junior in high school, the law recognizes a position of trust. Teachers are vetted, trained, and licensed under the assumption that they are safe harbor for all children within their district, regardless of whether they are in the same classroom. The prosecution's strategy centered on this breach of trust. During pretrial discussions, it became clear that the focus would not just be on the act itself, but on the exploitation of the victim's age. Experts often point out that a 16-year-old's brain, specifically the frontal lobe responsible for impulse control and long-term consequence mapping, is not fully developed. When an adult, especially one who is a family friend and a teacher, initiates a sexual relationship, the law views it as a predatory act rather than a consensual one. Legal analysts pointed out that Mackenzie's background as a teacher actually removed her ability to claim ignorance. Every licensed educator in the state undergoes mandatory training regarding boundary invasions and their role as a mandated reporter. If Mackenzie had seen another adult interacting with JD the way she had, she would have been legally required to report it to the authorities. By engaging in the behavior herself, she wasn't just breaking a law, she was violating the core ethical code of her profession. For the defense, the options were narrowing. With a full confession on record and digital evidence corroborated by both the husband and the victim, a not guilty verdict at trial seemed statistically improbable. Arraignments are typically formal proceedings where a defendant enters a plea, and while many expected Mackenzie to plead guilty given her confession, the standard legal advice is often to plead not guilty initially. This allows the defense attorney to review the discovery, every piece of evidence the police gathered, to ensure no procedural errors were made. Did the police Mirandize her at the correct time? Was the husband's search of her phone legally admissible under Washington's privacy laws? Outside the courtroom, the impact on the St. John community deepened. The school district began its own internal investigation to ensure no other students had been targeted. While there was no evidence of other victims, the fear and suspicion remained. Parents who had trusted their 6-year-olds to Mackenzie's care were now forced to have difficult conversations with their children. The school, once a place of total safety, now felt tainted by the scandal. There was also the question of Mackenzie's own personal life. She is a mother herself, a fact that added a layer of complexity to the public's perception of the case. While the criminal case focused on JD, Child Protective Services, CPS, typically conducts its own investigation in cases like this to determine if the children within the defendant's home are safe. This is a separate process from the criminal trial, but for a mother facing prison time and the loss of her career, it represented a second, equally devastating front in her legal battle. As Friday approached, the day of her formal arraignment, the town waited to see if she would take responsibility or if this case would head toward a protracted and painful trial. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The arraignment of Mackenzie not marked the beginning of the end for her career in education. Regardless of the final sentence, the loss of her teaching license is a near certainty. In cases of sexual misconduct with a minor, state licensing boards almost always move for permanent revocation. The path from being a first-grade teacher to a convicted felon is one that leaves no room for a return to the classroom. The legal landscape she now navigates is one of mitigation. If the case proceeds to a plea bargain, which the majority of such cases do, her attorney will likely emphasize her lack of a prior criminal record and her initial cooperation with the investigation after her first denial. However, the prosecution will counter with the aggravating factors: the age gap, her position of trust, and the evidence that she coached the victim to keep the secret. One of the most permanent consequences Mackenzie faces is the requirement to register as a sex offender. In Washington, the length and level of registration depend on the specific findings of the court, but it is a label that follows a defendant for years, if not a lifetime. For someone who worked in a school, the irony is sharp. Sex offender registration often carries restrictions on how close a person can live to schools, playgrounds, and daycares. The very places that defined her professional life would become the places she is legally barred from approaching. The victim, JD, and his family remain the central figures in the quest for justice. The prosecutor's office has emphasized the toll this has taken on the teenager's life. In the age of social media, getting out in a small town means more than just gossip at the local diner. It means digital footprints that are nearly impossible to erase. The receipts her husband found on Snapchat were just the beginning. The trauma of the encounter, combined with the public nature of the scandal, has created a long road to recovery for the young man involved. As the legal system grinds forward, the community of St. John is left to pick up the pieces. The school district continues to emphasize its commitment to student safety, but the trust that was broken will take years to rebuild. The story of Mackenzie not is a cautionary tale of the devastating ripples caused by a single night of alleged misconduct. It serves as a reminder that in a position of power, there is no such thing as a private mistake when a child is the one paying the price. The case of the first-grade teacher from St. John is now in the hands of the courts, where the facts of that midnight meeting on May 3rd will be weighed against the laws of the state. For Mackenzie Knott, the gavel has yet to fall on her final sentence, but the verdict of her community, and the end of her life as she knew it, has already been delivered. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe, like and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.